everyone. My name is Vicky Fox. I'm the Chief Executive of the Court, and it's a great pleasure to welcome everybody here in person and also everybody that's watching online. I'd like to send a really warm welcome to everybody that's here. I need to start with a little bit of housekeeping. If an alarm goes off, it will not be a test, so please leave this room immediately through the doors behind you. Don't take the lifts, and court staff will be here to help you safely out of the building. The 1st of October 2009 was a real significant date in the constitutional history of the UK. On that day, the newly created Supreme Court of the United Kingdom's doors opened, and since then we've welcomed over 1 million visitors to the court building, and many more millions have watched appeals online and interacted with our work. In the last few months, we've been marking that 15th anniversary, visiting Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and holding events for schools and university students, explaining the work and the relevance of the court. We serve the public by ensuring that the court's work is visible and accessible, and we know that transparency and accessibility are critical to public confidence and trust in the court. And so tonight we have a wonderful opportunity to hear from an expert panel about how to build confidence and trust in public institutions, the meaning of public service, and how difficult decisions are made in a complex and turbulent world. Facilitating that conversation is Bronwen Maddox. Bronwen took up the post of Director and Chief Executive of Chatham House in August 2022. Before joining Chatham House, Bronwen was Director of the Institute for Government, an independent think tank promoting better government. Bronwen is also Visiting Professor in the Policy Institute at King's College London, Honorary Governor of Ditchley, an Honorary Fellow of the British Academy, and a Council Member of Research England. Bronwen, over to you.
Vicky, thank you very much indeed, and all of you welcome, and welcome to those who are joining us online. It's my great privilege to be here facilitating this discussion on the meaning of public service, the meaning of public trust, in conversation with the terrific panel, if I can call you that in television terms, that we have here tonight. The Lord Reid, President of the Supreme Court, the very Reverend Dr. David Hoyle, Dean of Westminster, and Professor Catherine K. O'Regan from the Bonavero Institute of Human Rights from the University of Oxford. I'm going to ask them in a moment to introduce themselves a little bit more length and say a little bit about what public service means to them. But let me just start off by saying a bit about the importance of this discussion that we're having on this 15th anniversary, and why I leapt at the chance to come here on this evening, tearing myself away from my colleagues all analysing the Middle East back at Chatham House, which, if you don't know, is a think tank specialising not just in international relations, but in, according to its mandate of more than 100 years, formed in the ashes of the First World War, is to bring together people who often see the world very differently and to champion the rule of law above the rule of force. But nonetheless, I've left that to come here because of the importance of this discussion of trust in public institutions. And we were discussing just briefly outside how if you begin to take trust out of the framework, you are left with very little, a handful of dust in the famous phrase. It is very hard for the other institutions of our world, of our culture, our society, to work if you don't have trust there. We, I think, are not in that position at all in the UK, but we can look around at countries which do suffer that lack of trust in the most basic institutions, whether of government, of law, some of the financial institutions that underpin their economy, and see just how difficult it is, not just for them to work and prosper, but for individuals to deal with each other and have a sense of purpose in their own lives and of trust in each other. And we are speaking at a time when we're all conscious of the challenge to public trust and public institutions. You can hear it in all kinds of public debate, and most certainly hear it in the debate about government, where people questioning whether the contract that they thought they had with their governments really is holding up. So these are the kind of things that we're going to go into, and we're also going to go into the use of moral frameworks for making difficult decisions, but in a way that still maintains the integrity, the legitimacy of the institutions we're discussing. Very, very different institutions. And I'm going to leave a short half of the time, if I can put it that way, for your questions, so please do start thinking of them. With that, let me turn to Lord Reid and let me thank you again for bringing this discussion together. Let me ask you to, if I can say in your own courtroom, introduce yourself, but also say a bit about what public service has meant to you in your career.
Well, I would say that when I was growing up, public service was something that was greatly valued in society. And when you went to university, the expectation really was that you would go on to some form of public service. You might go into one of the liberal professions, as I did, going to the bar, or you might go into education, or you might go into the civil service or the diplomatic service. But one way or another, you would be serving the public. That was in the 1970s. I think the 1980s was something of a saw cultural change in our country, and now you see the ablest graduates tend to gravitate towards the highest earnings in the city, in banking or the like. So for me, I went to the bar. That's a profession which has a public service ethic. It's very strongly committed to the barrister assisting the court, behaving with integrity, and being, we have a thing called the cab rank rule, so you'll accept instructions, you don't pick and choose your clients. And then the natural progression was regarded as being to go onto the bench if you were invited to do so. That was in the days before appointments commissions. And the feeling really was that if you were a successful barrister, you were earning a good salary, and when the time came, you would take a drop in earnings, go on the bench, and give back to society. So I spent about half my career at the bar and the other half on the bench, and I feel I've been serving the public in both of those capacities.
Thank you very much indeed for taking us straight into that. I think you've raised already implicitly the question of what if the public doesn't appreciate that, and have things begun to change? But thank you for that arc that you've taken us through, and I think you're right about the 1980s. I was at university then, and remember my economics tutors making exactly that point about the changing mores. Catherine Regan, may I come to you next?
Yes, of course. So, of course, how one thinks about public service is dependent to some extent on where you grew up and the context in which you grew up. So I grew up in apartheid South Africa, and the idea of public service there, at least to me, looking at the people that I admired and who were my role models, was basically to be opposed to the state and to seek a way in terms of which a more just society could be established. And I think that influenced my thinking. It was one of the things that took me into law. I'd originally decided to do journalism, but I was advised that it was useful as a journalist to know the law, because there was an enormous amount of law that was prohibiting free speech, that was imposing censorship. And so I studied law and never returned to journalism. But I do think that that experience of growing up and realizing how important it was to be willing to try to make a contribution to a more just society seemed to me to be an important part of what it meant to be committed to public service. And of course, as the transition unfolded in the 1990s, after the release of the political prisoners, Nelson Mandela and the other members of the African National Congress and Pan-Africanist Congress in 1990, it became clear as we began to talk about the way forward and constitutional change that institutions were going to be core to this. And one of the important parts, I think, of building a more just society became very clear about building institutions within which I would include Parliament and courts and other public institutions, but also institutions, private institutions, media, civil society, universities, that would be thinking about what would be in the public interest and how could you contribute to the public interest at that time. And I had this rather extraordinary experience of being appointed to the Constitutional Court in 1994 as one of the first judges. So, that was a moment when it was clear the court was going to be important. But very quickly, when you sit on a court, you realize it may be a powerful and important court, but it's nothing without a strong civil society and a strong public backing for the project of constitutional change and transformation.
Thank you very much again, and you've again taken us right into this question of the need for public trust in these institutions, which we're going to dive into in more detail soon. Reverend Hoyle.
I'm actually the son of two lawyers and grew up in a house where law was thought of as a vocation, and in a home in which life was to be lived with an abiding set of values. I ended up not becoming a lawyer, finding my answers to some of the questions that were being asked elsewhere. Then discovered as a person of faith that the presiding assumption that faith is private is mistaken. We have churches and we have priests because faith is fundamentally public. Put another way, I'm saved in company or I'm not saved at all. We're supposed to love God and our neighbour. So I find myself preaching and teaching in a Christian community that thinks that the public square matters immensely. And then both in cathedral ministry, which I was in until I came here 5 years ago, and much more particularly now that I'm in the Church of Coronation, one of my responsibilities is to preside over convening space. How do we meet? How do we gather? How can we agree any kind of public conversation around something like a coronation or any of the big events we celebrate in the Abbey, if we are struggling, as we are struggling, with a sense of shared values?
Thank you very much again. Really beautifully put. So let's dive straight into the main question, which is really about what engenders public trust in institutions and what begins to challenge that or undermine it. And Lord Reid, I wondered if you could take us into that.
Well, I think trust in our institutions has taken a very long time to develop. It's we're the beneficiaries of a very long heritage, and unfortunately, trust can be lost much more quickly than it can be gained. It's absolutely vital to an institution like the Supreme Court because we are guardians of the law, and the law expresses the institutional values of our society. And so when the chips are down, we're one of the final backstops for our way of life. For example, when we had the prorogation case some years ago, what was an issue there was whether we are a parliamentary democracy where Parliament is sovereign, or are we not? Are we a country where it's actually the government that's sovereign?
And can therefore prorogue Parliament.
And therefore allows Parliament to sit only as and when it pleases. But you can't really have a more fundamental question about the sort of polity that we live in than that. and it came down to this court to defend what we felt are the fundamentals of our Constitution. Now, a case like that, because passions run high over the underlying the issue that prompted the prorogation, Brexit in that case, because passions were running high. Of course, it's a controversial decision, and you get criticised in the media, criticised in the political world, and so there is a real danger of losing trust. And so the court has to respond by a strategy which has a number of strands. One is you have to be, like any institution that's exercising governmental powers, you have to be transparent. You have to be honest. You have to be accessible so far as you can. You have to explain yourself clearly. We, I felt, had to reach out after that controversy to other institutions, government, parliament, and other stakeholders in our society, to make ourselves better understood, to try to counter misunderstandings which were liable to damage trust in the court very, very severely. I mean, if people are being told, if the general public are being told that the court is simply imposing its political views on of a liberal elite on the rest of society, or it's undertaking political adventurism and going into areas where it's got no business. You can't just passively allow that to pass. You have to tackle it. It's an unusual thing for judges to do because we don't usually engage in a public debate in that kind of way. But when the need arises, you have to respond, engage with the public and the public's representatives. You have to have a very good communication strategy. And so that this court has a very good communications team. And by making ourselves understood, making our role understood, you hope that you will help to maintain trust.
And it seems to me, if you'll allow me to say, my years of writing about Parliament and talking to MPs since then, that in the argument you've just put of arguing, look, Parliament is sovereign, it is not for the government of the day to say when it sits. You got quite a bit of purchase with Parliament itself, with MPs who found that argument actually very congenial as well as persuasive. But you do get from politicians, not just from the government of that day, from politicians, if you like, populist retort of, you're not elected, we're elected, so that is a higher justification. What is your response to that?
Well, you tell them that you don't have to be democratically elected judges in order to support democracy. You need to be democratically elected in our system in order to make legislation. But our job isn't to legislate, our job is to apply legislation. You don't need to, for example, in the Rwanda case, where we held that the government's policy was unlawful because it was in breach of legislation enacted by Parliament. So I sometimes get asked by members of Parliament, how on earth could you decide that? You're not democratically elected. Well, the answer is, no, but you are. You make the laws, we apply them. That's how democracy is made effective.
Thank you. Professor O'Regan, how have you responded to these those kind of challenges? And you took us right at the end of your bit of biography to that extraordinary moment, the forming of this constitutional court. Many people inside and outside South Africa wanting that court to do its work smoothly, and yet it was not without controversy.
No, that's right. I think the court had one great advantage, which it was there to interpret a written constitution that had been adopted in the very generation in which the court was interpreting it. So in terms of the powers conferred upon the court, they had been conferred upon the court effectively by democratically elected representatives of the people with their eyes wide open and with no controversy that this was a power given to the court. And with a modern constitution, obviously, there's a text which has been thought through and adapted to modern circumstances. And I say all of that to illustrate the contrast with, for example, the United States Constitution, which of course is now a very much older constitution. And I think it is a much more difficult task. I think one of the greatest difficulties for courts, and that's whether you have a written constitution or not, is making plain to people when the court hears a case that it does so with fidelity to law, that it's not just what judges think. And again, there are cases or courts where you do feel that there seems to have been a shift towards a sort of a policy-oriented court. But I think that that's difficult for people to understand, that actually when a court hears a case about something which seems very topical and upon which we all have...
You're talking about a court anywhere
in the world.
Yeah.
So, I mean, one of the very first case the South African Constitutional Court had to hear was whether the death penalty was constitutional or not. Now, pretty well everybody in South Africa had a view as to whether they thought we should have the death penalty or not.
And presumably not the same view.
And not the same view. In fact, truth is, probably about 70 to 80% of the people thought we should have the death penalty. And one of the reasons they thought we should have the death penalty is we had very high levels of violent crime, as South Africa still does. And the Constitution provides that everyone shall have the right to life, full stop. And so the court held unanimously that this constitutional right to life, despite the fact that the court knew that 70 to 80% of the people were not going to be very happy with this decision, was what the Constitution required, and that the death penalty could not be justified in the context of such a strong right to life. And I think that
And what was the response then? So this is a very good example because, as you said, of a big block of public opinion against what you had just, according to the Constitution, decided.
It was a deeply unpopular decision. I still think, 30 years later, it's arguably the most unpopular decision the court ever handed down. But the government immediately accepted it and accepted that there wouldn't be a death penalty, and there was nobody further executed. But it wasn't popular. On the other hand, there have been many cases that the court has heard which have been very popular, which people have really liked. And I think that over time, by and large, there are people who would be unhappy with particular decisions or with the court more generally. But by and large, the court has built a level of public trust around the fact that it is deciding cases on this Constitution. And some of those cases are very, very difficult and not easy to get the right answer. But it seems to me what is important as to how you build trust is exactly as Lord Reid has said, to be as open and as clear as you can be about the nature of the task, welcoming people into the court, welcoming, as we did, televisions and this court has done, and also thinking about the mode in which you write your decisions so that they can be accessible, particularly to journalists who are then going to translate them to the broader public. So we spent a lot of time as well on press statements. But I do think that at the end of the day, it's not a popularity contest for courts. Courts have to hold the line, and in some ways I think the responsibility is on other people in the system, the legal profession in particular, who need to defend the court when the court is challenged, because it's not our job to be popular or to be elected, but it is to uphold the law. And people need to defend the court when the court does that properly. And I think it's difficult for courts to get into the defensive position of defending what they've done. I think being open and transparent is one thing, but being defensive is not wise and not called for. And that is the task, I think, that falls on others, particularly the legal profession, legal academics, universities, and the like.
That is an immensely important point, I think, about the tone in which an institution, in this case the judiciary, presents itself, and the not being defensive. I think it's an extremely important recommendation. Reverend Hoyle, I wonder if in turning to you, I'm stepping into the most controversial ground of all. Is it your job to be popular?
No, it's not my job to be popular. I think I have two jobs, I have two significant things to say as a priest. The first is that in giving an account of ourselves, our language would be about sin and repentance. Another way of putting it is sometimes we have to be really clear that things aren't quite as bad as people think, they're actually rather worse. So that doesn't always make you very popular. And then the other thing
I'm sorry, how do you mean exactly?
I think in terms of public commentary, I think in terms of what we are saying in the Abbey, what we will say as we get quite close to Christmas is what is happening in our public life gives really significant cause for concern, and we should be really clear about what is wrong. So I think part of my job is to articulate that, and then another part of my job is also to be hopeful. So I have to hold in tension both an analysis of what's happening to us and what kind of people, what kind of communities we might be, which might at times be quite bleak, at the same time saying that it is possible to do that differently.
And again, you're not arguing for the legitimacy of the institution that you're representing, but how do you present that institution, given that there are many faiths in this country and many people of no faith? How important is the establishment of the church?
It seems to me that one of the things we desperately lack at the moment is any kind of sustained conversation. So if you talk about values, values could be yours and values could be mine, and we might well not agree about what our values are. If we're talking about trust is a thing we share. But how do you build trust? Well, you build trust, I think, to some extent through conversation, through accountability, through authenticity, but fundamentally you do depend on there being conversation. Conversation's getting harder. It seems to me quite often I'm being invited to take sides. I'd been in post 2 weeks, walked across Parliament Square 5 years ago. The question was, what does God think about Brexit? That was an invitation to take sides very quickly. My job and the job of anyone who works in convening space is to try to hold on to the possibility that we can continue to talk to one another. I am finding that more difficult than I used to.
I mean, forgive me for just raising the point again, which you can absolutely step out of the way of if you choose, but the establishment of the church, is that useful in its legitimacy, in how people see it? Is it irrelevant to what you're saying?
I think it's becoming because it's increasingly contested and because it looks like privilege. I think it's probably becoming more of a handicap for us. There was a period in which actually a number of faith communities were grateful that there was this privileged position at the table for faith. But I think that seems to be less generally accepted now. So no, I don't think it's as easy to defend as it was.
If I could just add a point, I think the point that David made just now and that Kate made has a resonance with me, that we're all the time the subject of attempts to co-opt us into some political cause. And we get interpreted as if we are an extension of politics rather than an autonomous activity. For example, we had a couple of weeks ago a case to do with discrimination law involving transgender people. And immediately we're portrayed on social media and indeed in mainstream media as face of a choice that you either jump as you're on the side of radical feminists, or you're on the side of transgender people. And we're not, in fact, called on to take sides at all. What we're called on to do is to interpret the law. And people, I think, generally they just don't understand what judges actually do. I think they think we go into a room and have a vote depending on what our conscience tells us, or some sort of gut feeling. But of course, you spend many years studying law and then practicing law and learning it. And by the time you're deciding these cases at the level of this court, you've been a lawyer for about 40 years. You're applying a well-understood methodology and your to the interpretation of legislation. So it's a very professional activity. But people don't realise this, and you'll give a decision, and you'll be told that the Prime Minister or somebody will issue a statement saying he disagrees with the court's decision. And you think, well, what qualifications does that person have to express any opinion whatsoever?
And how do you think you should best respond in that moment?
Well, it's I think the point that Kate made, that we have to say, we just apply the law. If you don't like it, change it. That's not our job.
And I think that message has come across clearly in some recent decisions. Let's go to wider questions. It's not that I've run out of questions myself, and it's absolutely not that the three here have run out of things on this particular line, but I know that there will be quite a lot of questions. Who would like to start? Great. There is to right. There's one at the back towards the pillar, and I will take two at once, so if there's a second person.
Hello, I'm Claire Gilbert. I wanted to ask about the situation, in 1994 in South Africa, or in 1990, when did you have to write a new constitution, or did you have to comb the old constitution to take out all the apartheid references? And how were you regarded in that? Were you trusted as you rewrote, updated, corrected the constitution of the country?
Thank you. And is there another one? Great. At the back there.
James Lee, King's College, London. Thank you very much for the panel. I wonder what the cause of either decline or lack of institutional comity might be across the different institutions. It might be that there's always been the case, but it depends on political headwinds, or are there particular crises, events that trigger certain challenges, particularly for courts, but also for the church and legislatures. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. Let me take the first one, and that was directly to you.
Yes. So there was a long and quite complicated process of constitution writing, which began shortly after the liberation movements were unbanned in 1990. And actually, the new constitution, which is now the South African constitution, only came into force in 1997. And that involved, it actually took place in two stages. There was a very wide set of public consultations. It was, in fact, drafted and adopted by the newly elected members of Parliament in the first non-racial inclusive elections that took place in 1994. And so its legitimacy is rooted, in a sense, in the democratic representatives that were elected in 1994. But it was a very public conversation about what ought to be in the Constitution. And I think that was very important to its legitimacy. I think there is by and large, it is a complete change from what went before. But there are obviously institutional legacies. You know, institutions are path dependent. So, for example, our court system still bears some of the signs of having been established in the mid-19th century during the period of British colonialism. But there was a lot of thought about what do we want to keep, what do we want to change, and that was a very lively debate. And I think when you have a constitutional moment like that, if you do produce a constitutional text, it gives it a lot of legitimacy, which is very valuable. It can, of course, be lost in remarkably quickly. But nevertheless, I think the Constitution still has a reasonable amount of legitimacy. There's debate. It's a very noisy place, but it still has a reasonable amount.
Thank you for that. And do you want to just extend that to begin to answer the second question, which is about the things that cause legitimacy and trust to be lost?
So I think the difficult thing for courts, and Lord Reid has already referred to it in the context of the prorogation case, is when there is contestation between the high branches of government, between Parliament, the executive and the courts, over what the law is. And that happens in South Africa, that happens here in the United Kingdom, it happens in most democratic countries, actually. And those are always somewhat perilous times, because it is very much easier for politicians to attack courts than it is for courts to defend themselves, or frankly to say anything in the public domain. And as I've said already, I think it's probably generally unwise for courts to try to engage in any kind of dialogue with politicians, because it actually makes them look like politicians. Exactly Lord Reid's point. Courts are not actually engaged in politics in any democratic party political sort of endeavour, and getting involved in that dialogue makes it look like courts are. But of course, not being involved in the dialogue sort of leaves one side saying a lot and the other side saying nothing. So that's a real challenge, and I think it is a challenge for courts. My own view, as I've said already, is that I think it's one of the areas where the public service responsibilities of the legal profession arise, because they do need to stand up for courts and say, this decision may have been unpopular, but it is, according to the law, it is an entirely plausible, acceptable legal decision. And academics at universities can play the same role, and of course public commentators. I don't think it's easy for judges to participate in that kind of a dialogue.
Really, really interesting point. And David Hoyle, may I turn to you on this? And we were discussing in the run-up to this session a bit about the importance of being able to disagree with people still within a framework.
So my experience, excuse me, my experience has been that has got more difficult. I was part of a really hotly contested debate about the legacy of transatlantic slavery because I was Dean of Bristol, and found myself engaging with very, very different constituencies, and some of those constituencies would be clear that it was inappropriate to engage with a constituency like mine. I was compromised simply by my inheritance. That makes debate very difficult. More broadly, public commentators are very clear that conventions collapsed and competition has increased. I think as we live in a more competitive environment, I think that increases anxiety. I think I've seen anxiety at work in the institution I work for, in the Church of England. I think also in a very competitive environment, there's a greater danger of performative leadership. I was talking to an MP not very long ago, and she was explaining to me that actually she had to divorce her private and her public self because the abuse she experiences online is such that she simply has to distance herself from that personality. Now, I absolutely understand that, but that seems to me to be quite an uncomfortable place to be. And also, most of us have really quite a sharp eye for what is and is not authentic. And if we're having to live with that kind of internal dichotomy, we're in trouble.
And how do you use, then, a framework of values to come to a decision on, I mean, you mentioned slavery, but these are the immensely contested questions that suddenly are coming at people in your position?
What worked up to a point was finding sufficient numbers of people who were prepared to sit down and to talk, and And then people like me really need to learn. So, I mean, it's glaringly obvious, but it wasn't immediately obvious to me. I thought slavery was wicked, so I started campaigning against modern slavery. I was taken very politely on one side and said, that's a very good thing to do. It's not what we're talking about. But I needed someone to explain that to me. It's why the conversation matters.
Thank you. Audrey. And the question, I didn't mean to bend it. The answers were just so interesting, but the thrust of the second question was very much about the things that cause legitimacy to be questioned.
Yeah. I would respond to Professor Lee's question about institutional comity, that so far as the courts are concerned, I think tensions between courts and other institutions of government are inevitable, and they're not necessarily a bad thing. It's in the nature of things that from time to time other bodies in the state are going to be pushing the boundaries of their powers, and if they overstep the mark, it's the court's function to say so. I'm not sure we would want to live in a country where the courts and the government, for example, always saw eye to eye. That might be the position in China, but I don't think it's going to be the position in any democratic country. What's more worrying is if there is an acute lack of comity, but in this country, in modern times, we've only seen that exceptionally in the circumstances surrounding Brexit, which were very exceptional circumstances, where you had the referendum result meant that there was the opportunity for a populist rhetoric, and the divisions in the governing party meant that there were exceptional problems for the government in getting its programme through Parliament. The Fixed Term Parliaments Act meant that there wasn't the possibility of calling a general election, and so the government was really compelled to look for a solution in the use of prerogative powers, and that gave rise to constitutional questions that we hadn't seen in this country since the 17th century, which then ended up in the courts.
And on the world's media, and they're camping outside with fascination, waiting for these things to be explained to them. But we're talking here about a case, obviously, between the Supreme Court, and the government. Many people's experience of the legal system is not with this court, but is with other courts, criminal courts, magistrates' courts, big delays in those. They're very publicised problems in the wider justice system at the moment. Do you feel that can affect the reputation, the public standing of the judicial system overall?
Yes, I'm sure it does. I think if people have the impression that the courts are in crisis, and also if they have the impression that only the well-off are able to access the courts, then it's bound to damage the standing of the courts generally.
Thank you. Do we have some more questions? Right, there's one there.
Thank you very much. Very interesting conversation. I wanted to ask about, going back to the topic of public trust and public service, how can we bridge this gap between trust and truth? Because in the world of influencers and social media, there seems to be an ever-growing gap between, your role in being guardians of trust, but also we need to be guardians of truth. And I feel trust and truth go together, but we are really distancing the two concepts. And so how can you do your job so well when truth is actually probably the biggest challenge we have in the world of algorithms as well? Things are amplified, and I grew up under communism, so truth is of particular importance to me, having been lied to for about 15 years of my life. So anyway, that's my question.
Thank you very much. There is no pressure to say your name, but if you would like to, now is your opportunity.
Sure, Dana Dennis Smith. I'm from First 100 Years Project.
Thank you very much indeed. And then there was one here in the front, right in the front, more in the front. I'll come to the back after that. Oops.
Yes, thank you very much. Is that working?
Yes.
Yes.
I was very interested with Kate O'Regan's dichotomy between education and dialogue, in the sense that I think everybody's agreed that a very important method of maintaining public trust in an institution is education and transparency. But I think you then said, but we mustn't get too close to the politicians. We don't want, as I understood you to say, a dialogue. And I suppose I was really just asking how you think you can educate politicians fully if you don't engage in direct dialogue.
That's really interesting. And can I just have a show of hands of how many other people would like to ask questions? I know there's one more. Right at the back. Let's take all of them now, because we're sort of coming to the end. But I want to get more in. So there, yes, please.
Thanks, Bronwen. It's Alex Thomas from the Institute for Government, and it's a great pleasure to see my former boss chairing this discussion.
Hi, Alex.
I wanted to ask the wisdom of the panel, really, and how to calibrate our anxiety and our needs around this question between complacency and panic, both of which I'd suggest are wrong, particularly on a subject where it seems to me, once trust has been lost, it will be very, very hard to restore. So it feels like we're on a sort of, if we are on a one-way track to losing trust and public confidence on some of these questions, how do we know when we really need to act, and how should we be calibrating our anxiety around that?
All right, let me take those three because they're all rich questions. The gap between trust and truth, education and dialogue, and complacency, and what was the word you used? Pain. Yes. Panic. Yes. Great. Where should we start? Lord Reid.
Goodness. I think the easiest of the questions is my colleague Lord Borough's question about education and dialogue. How do you educate politicians, for example, unless you're prepared to engage in dialogue with them? That's been my take on it. We have to be very careful in that dialogue. We don't. It's not part of that dialogue to justify our decisions, but we do. But it is alarming when you talk to politicians and you discover just how little they understand of what we do. I mean, just to give one example, an MP I spoke to recently asked me if we gave any reasons for our decisions. When told that we did, are they publicly available? And if they are, do you have to pay a small fortune in order to see them? So, I mean, that's the level of understanding. So I think we do need to engage, as matters stand, I feel we do need to engage in outreach, which encompasses the political world, but it has to be within well-understood boundaries. Trust and truth, it's extremely difficult. I mean, we are a small organisation with a very modest budget. We do what we can by way of education and outreach, and the other matter, the transparency and so forth that I mentioned earlier. We do what a court can, but it's a much bigger problem. What I aim to do is to make others who may be in a position to do more about it, in government, for example, and also elsewhere in society, in the city, for example, to make them understand that the rule of law is absolutely fundamental to our way of life, to our prosperity, and it's dependent on there being an independent judiciary, and that's dependent on people having trust in the courts and not feeling that they need politicians to take over the process of appointments and accountability and so on. So you have to get that. So I try to get that message over. But as I say, trying to combat what one reads on social media is really too big a task for the court to undertake on its own. Complacency and panic, that's the most, I've left that to the last, it's the most difficult question of the three. We certainly are not complacent. We see what is happening in other countries, including countries where one might have taken respect for the courts and the rule of law for granted until very recently. So we're certainly not complacent. We're not panicking. Just to give you an idea, on Friday I took part in a discussion about populism and courts at the University of Milan with a group of speakers from Italy and the United States. And I was left with the impression that we are in a much better place than either of those countries in relation to confidence and trust in the courts. So I'm not panicking, but I'm not complacent.
Thank you. Professor, very good.
Well, perhaps I might start with the complacency and panic. And I think one of the things about living in democracies is they often seem to be at risk. The project of democracy is actually to put our disagreements into the public domain and to engage upon them. Authoritarian societies are the societies which close down on conflict and disagreement. And so I think it's important to develop that ability to be vigilant, but to recognize that we do disagree and it is okay to disagree. And the real risk comes when you think the institutions are at risk. Will there be another set of free and fair elections? Will the courts continue to be independent and impartial? Those are the moments for panic, not the moments of deep disagreement, it seems to me. And I think that I often tell people that there's a wonderful museum of the American Constitution in Philadelphia. And, you know, obviously 240 years or whatever it is of the Constitution. And frankly, when you walk in it now, and those 200 years or 250 years are condensed down, it seems, frankly, to lurch from one crisis to the next. And that's sort of, I think, what democracy is. It is lurching from one crisis to the next in a very visible way. The real question is, are we going to be able to have free and fair elections, independent courts, and fundamental respect for human beings, or is that actually what's at risk? On the question of truth and trust, I think this is a very difficult issue. We do live in a society in which increasingly people are believing in things that are untrue. They seem to be believing in them for sort of emotional reasons very often. It's that my husband has an expression which is, I've got my opinions, don't confuse me with the facts. And I think there's a lot of that. People are embedded in their opinions. There's an emotional attachment to them. And we do quite a bit of work on sort of social media, and it's very clear that all the mechanisms that have been developed to try to ensure that people understand that information that's being given to them is inaccurate, whether it's fact-checking or flagging or anything like that, has very little impact on what people believe. So I think this is an issue of ongoing difficulty, and I'm not sure how we're going to resolve it. And I do think you're right that it connects to trust, because that emotional belief in something which is not true often also goes along with distrusting the organizations and institutions that are telling you it's untrue. So whether it's vaccinations, or whether the American elections of 2020 were free and fair and what the result was, these things become, they're facts which people are disputing, and it's very difficult to work out how to actually get an agreed basis of fact. So I think that is a greatly risky thing. And I just say one quick thing on Andy's question. I think Lord Reid is absolutely right. It's building the right barrier for that conversation.
Thank you.
And it does have to happen.
Thank you. Reverend Hoyle, you got the last word. Coming up to the hour.
You might remember I said that my job is sometimes to say how bad is it and then how good can it be. So I think we should be clear that it is pretty bad, and it's pretty bad particularly when we have a crisis about authenticity and when we have a crisis about truth. Being clear that one of the reasons we respect the courts, I think, is that we see in the courts an institution in which the resources to make a decision are laid out in front of us. Some people don't notice, but that is what the courts do. We should be asking questions about what resources are there that backs up the statements that are being made. We should be asking those questions more urgently, and we should be defending debate more than we were. And then, if I may, it's been my experience, because I have a rather curious job and then find myself in places like this, that those of us who work in significant institutions in our national life are aware that we are facing some very difficult problems. Actually, it's inappropriate for most of us to comment. Therefore, I think there is a real need for those people who are in a position to comment to be slightly more strident about just how difficult the situation is at the moment, but also, I would say, to express for us what better might look like. So it is bad, but we should be much better than we are at saying what does the good look like.
Thank you very much for that. And on that note, well, I think we're going to have to stop now. So I know there's a couple more questions. Lord Reid, I need your guidance on 2 points. One is, do the people here have any more opportunity to ask questions of the people here?
No, I think we need to close it down.
We need to close it down.
Yeah.
No, so there isn't that. And then the second thing, seems to be not always quite appropriate to applaud in a courtroom. And the city is a populist thing, but I would nonetheless like to invite the audience to applaud the discussion. Thank you very much indeed for coming. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your attention and your interest in this important. And Lord Reid and colleagues, thank you very much for putting this together.